Welcome everyone to the 2022 General Election Initiative Explainer, sponsored by the Project for an Informed Electorate at Sacramento State University, in partnership for many years now with the Sacramento Public Library. And for most of the years since 2012, we've also been so lucky to have the analysts at the Legislative Analyst's Office donate their time and their energy and their smarts to explain the initiatives to us. So, in many ways, I think this is the best initiative explainer for that reason. And we have a chance to ask them questions. And it's really nice to ask questions of people who actually know what they're talking about. So welcome to this initiative explainer. I'm going to turn the time over for a moment to Kathy Crosthwaite from the Sacramento Public Library.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to see you taking the time to be here for this program. My name is Kathy Crosthwaite, the Deputy Director overseeing Public Services for the Sacramento Public Library. We're fortunate to partner with Dr. Kim Nalder and the Project for an Informed Electorate, better known as PI, to bring this event to you. Since 2016, I have come to rely on this program to make my own informed voting decisions and base my choices on facts, not emotions, which commercials can so easily elicit. We love facts at the Sacramento Public Library, but of course, we also love fiction. I encourage you to check out our resources at saclibrary.org, where you can find daily newspapers like the Sacramento Bee, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal, or browse our catalog for the latest best-selling novels and nonfiction works in every format possible. Or maybe you just need a hedge trimmer, or a state park pass, or maybe a cake pan in the shape of a mermaid. Yes, we have all of these items too. The public library is your community resource for many things, not just books. We're also proud to partner with the Sacramento Registrar's Office so that we can make voting as easy and accessible to the communities we serve. 27 of our 28 locations will have ballot boxes available during the library's open hours from October 11th through November 5th. 14 of our locations will act as 4-day vote centers from November 5th to November 8th. 27 branches will be open from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. on Election Day. We look forward to having you visit us to drop off your ballot and get to know your public library just a little bit better. We live by our motto that books are just the beginning. And now on to tonight's program. Thank you, Kim.
Thank you so much. We've appreciated this partnership for so many years, and don't forget to vote at the public library. All right, I just wanted to plug a couple of Project for an Informed Electorate events that are coming up. You can check out the PI website. I know that's a long URL. It's probably easier just to Google it, but we've got another event where we'll be showing these videos and talking about how you can prepare to vote on October 4th at 5:30 on Zoom. You can look on our website for that link. We're having a trivia night on campus for students where we're talking about the ballot, and we have fabulous prizes and teams of students competing. That'll be in late October. We'll let you know on that one. And then we'll have a recap of the election on November 16th. And again, we'll let you know the details on that. So check out the Project for an Informed Electorate website to find out about those events. And then a little bit of housekeeping for tonight. This is being recorded, so just know that. One of the best parts about that fact is that we end up making videos per initiative. So there will be 5 to 6 minute videos produced for each initiative that you can share with your friends and family after this event. They'll be ready in about a week. During this event, though, if you want captions, you can click the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. And you can watch some captions. They are AI generated, so they won't be perfect. They might be funny at some point, who knows, but you can check those out. And if you're having any issues, you can go into the chat. It'll just come to the folks who are behind the scenes here. And then if you have questions, and we hope you do, there's a Q&A button and you can submit your questions. Go ahead and do that at any time. If you already have questions when we get to that initiative, go ahead and plug those in. Or if something occurs as we're going through them, please put those questions in. We're happy to do that. And that's one of the big advantages of being at this event. So let's get started with Proposition 1 with Luke Kuzmero from the Legislative Analyst's Office.
Good evening. I'm Luke Kushmaro with the Legislative Analyst Office. Before I get into Proposition 1, I'll briefly introduce our office and then talk about the proposition. The Legislative Analyst Office has a constitutional responsibility to provide impartial analysis of statewide propositions that appear on the ballot. In this role, we aim to help voters understand what a proposition would do if passed and the potential fiscal impacts. One important note is that we do not weigh in on the merits of the propositions or the arguments made by the proponents or the opponents. However, we are happy to answer questions you might have about the propositions and their potential effects. Getting into Proposition 1, this is in regards to a constitutional amendment regarding reproductive freedom. I'll start off with a little bit of background, then talk about the proposition. At the federal level, in the past, the US Supreme Court has found that the US Constitution generally protected the right to abortion, and as a result, states had limited ability to place restrictions on abortions. However, in June 2022, the US Supreme Court decided that the US Constitution does not protect the right to abortion. As such, states now have more flexibility to decide whether or not to allow, limit, or ban abortions. When it comes to contraceptives, birth control, the US Supreme Court has found that the US Constitution protects the right to buy and use contraceptives. In addition, the federal law requires most health insurance plans to pay for contraceptives. At the state level, the California Constitution guarantees the right to privacy, and the California Supreme Court has found that this right includes the right to reproductive choices, such as whether or not to have an abortion or use contraceptives. In addition, state law was later passed to protect these specific rights in statute. State law has placed some restrictions on abortions. However, because of the way the California courts have interpreted the constitutional right to privacy, the state can only restrict abortions in certain circumstances, such as to protect public health and safety. Two situations where this occurs is that abortion providers must be licensed, and once a fetus is viable, abortions can only be performed if the pregnancy puts the pregnant person's life or health at risk. Now, getting to Proposition 1, this would change the California Constitution by adding language saying that the state cannot deny or interfere with a person's reproductive freedom, and that people have the fundamental right to choose whether or not to have an abortion and whether or not to use contraceptives. Because these rights already exist in California, the proposition would have no direct fiscal effect. However, whether a court might interpret the proposition to expand reproductive rights beyond existing law is unclear. In the event that a court does find that the proposition expands these rights, there could be fiscal effects to the state. And with that, I will turn it back over to Kim and then take any questions you may have. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. All right. So first of all, who put this on the ballot? The state legislature did. It was almost a party line vote. They did have, I think, one Republican vote or maybe two. They did so after the Dobbs ruling overturning Roe versus Wade. And next, we're going to go into endorsements, and then we'll do campaign funding, and we'll do that for each of the initiatives. So in support of this one, we have our governor, several members who are Democrats of the Assembly and the State Senate, and the Democratic Party of California. In opposition, we have the Republican Party and the association that, the State Assembly Republican Party of California as well. So this is a party differential. And as far as groups go, we have abortion rights groups, as you might imagine, that are in support of it. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, League of Women Voters, SEIU, Equality California. And in opposition, we have the California Conference of Catholic Bishops, California Alliance of Pregnancy Care, and some faith-based organizations. So I should say just at the beginning here that these lists of endorsements may not be comprehensive. There could be some that we've missed out on, but we've looked at several different places to find these endorsements. So they should be legit, but there could be some that are missing if you want to keep, looking at endorsements, if that helps you. And then as far as newspapers go, we have several newspapers around the state that have weighed in support of this measure, but none who have weighed in opposition. And then for expenditures, we have a Native American tribe that's given a lot of money in favor, the California Medical Association, Planned Parenthood, as you might expect, California Teachers Association, ACLU, and then in opposition, East Valley Republican Women and Patriots Store, and then some very much smaller amounts from individuals. So you can see that there's a big, okay, another thing that I want to say is that these two figures don't always line up. They're from two different sources. This one is more up to date than this. These second slides that have the total are meant to just give you an overall idea about the amount of money being spent on this and how lopsided it is. So take it a little bit with a grain of salt because new numbers keep coming in. So the supporters have put a lot more money into it essentially than the opponents at this point. All right, what questions do you have? Please put those questions in the Q&A. And Andrea, Terry, if you could also put your camera back on, and Luke as well, and we will go ahead with whatever questions we have from the audience. If you have questions, I see some hands are raised. If you could type them into the Q&A, please.
I'm seeing one question right now, Kim, which is just, will the PowerPoint be available for downloading?
We will have the videos that have the PowerPoint in them. We could add the PowerPoint too, sure. It'll be on the the PI website. What questions do you have about Prop 1? Luke, could I get you back here?
So I have a question here from Diane that says, does a yes vote allow for late term abortions if the life of the mother and child is not threatened?
So the current statute would remain on the books, which includes a restriction on post-viability abortions unless the health or well-being of the pregnant person is at risk. Whether or not a court might ultimately change that finding is unclear. That ultimately would be something that would be determined by the courts.
And the next question, if there's another state law about reproductive freedom being a right, how does this proposition add to those rights or guarantee these rights more?
Yes, so as I noted before, the California Supreme Court has interpreted the Constitution to include the rights to abortion and contraceptives, as well as other reproductive rights. And then state law specifically requires this. This would change the Constitution to specifically require this. So it would no longer depend on the court's interpretation of the right to reproductive privacy to include these. Essentially, what that means is that the legislature would not be able to change reproductive rights, which they currently could do under statute, so long as they meet that definition. And then there could be some back and forth with the Constitution, but it would now be specifically defined in the Constitution rather than depending on the court interpretation and then statute.
Great. And then the next question is, would this change insurance companies' requirements to cover procedures and prescriptions for birth control?
So it shouldn't have a significant effect there, as far as I'm aware. Federal law already requires most health insurance plans to cover contraceptives. When it comes to abortions, it gets a little more complicated, but this shouldn't have any impact on that, especially if there is no court decision finding that this is a change to reproductive rights, assuming that this is just putting into plain language in the Constitution existing rights. There shouldn't be any sort of changes to that.
And then, is there a clear definition in this bill of reproductive freedom or reproductive rights?
So the bill does not specifically define reproductive freedom. It does call specifically out abortions and birth control, but it does not necessarily limit it to those two categories.
And then next question, there are lots of questions on this one. If Prop 1 is passed, can a federal national abortion ban or restriction that passes through Congress supersede it?
Ultimately, it would probably depend on how that is structured. Due to our federal system, federal law typically trumps state law. It gets a little more messy when it comes to constitutional issues. So that likely would ultimately go through some sort of court process. But typically that would be the case, that federal would trump state.
Okay, thank you so much. We need to move on to the next initiative, but thank you so much for your questions. Let's do the same thing with this. I should introduce Professor Andrea Terry. She's a professor in the communications department at Sacramento State and is a PI affiliate. So she'll be handling the questioning. All right. So Proposition 26, we have Anita Lee presenting this one.
Good evening, everyone. Anita Lee with the Legislative Analyst Office. So following the same as Luke, I'm going to start off with a little bit of background and then walk you through the proposal and then finally the fiscal effects. So the California Constitution and state law limit gambling in California. So for example, state law bans sports betting, roulette, and games with dice like craps, but it does allow for some gambling. So I think the state lottery, card rooms, betting on horse racing, as well as tribal casinos. Currently for the tribal casinos, tribes have certain rights under federal law to govern themselves. And so this means that the state's regulation is really limited to what is allowed by federal law, as well as federally approved agreements between the state and the tribe known as a tribal state compact. And that compact really dictates how gambling activities will occur. Our state and local gambling laws are generally enforced in a variety of different ways. Some are by regulatory agencies or through civil lawsuits. And you also have California DOJ, the district attorneys in counties, and city attorneys that can file criminal cases. This proposition has really kind of two components. One set is related to sports betting or sports wagering, and then there are some other non-sports wagering related components. So related to sports betting, this proposition would allow the state's privately operated racetracks and tribal casinos to offer sports betting. For the racetracks, which will be 4 of them, they would be able to offer betting to people 21 years of age or older and require that they pay the state 10% of sports bets made each day after taking out prize payments. All of these revenues would also be deposited into this new special fund that is created. For tribes that would be offering sports betting, it would depend on the specific terms of the compacts when they're amended to allow for that to happen. And that includes whether or not they would also pay into this new special fund. If they don't pay into that new special fund, at minimum, they would have to pay for the costs of regulation. For all of those monies going into the new special fund, the proposition would require that about kind of 40% of it would first go to support education. Of the remaining 60%, the first call would be to cover state regulatory costs. After paying for the state regulatory costs, the remaining monies would be split in 3 ways. 15% for gambling addiction and mental health programs and grants, 15% for sports betting and gambling enforcement costs, and then 70% to the state's general fund. The key non-sports related sports betting related provisions are that it would allow roulette and games with dice like craps to be offered at tribal casinos if their compacts are amended to allow them to do so. And then it also allows for a new enforcement method to enforce gambling laws. And specifically, it would allow people or entities to file civil lawsuits seeking action under particular conditions. So in terms of the fiscal effects, the size of the fiscal effect will really depend on how this measure is interpreted and implemented. But in terms of thinking about state revenues, we believe that there will be increased state revenues, possibly reaching the tens of millions of dollars annually. For the effect on local government revenues, there could be various effects on local governments. Likely would not be large, but would be stemming in particular, for example, from the new kind of enforcement method to enforce gambling laws. It could mean that certain jurisdictions could bear a greater impact to the extent they get a larger share of their revenue, for example, from card rooms. There would also be increased state costs for state agencies to regulate in-person sports betting that could possibly reach the low tens of millions of dollars annually. And then finally, there would be increased state costs for DOJ and the state courts related to that new enforcement method that's not likely to exceed the low millions of dollars annually. And this is really because they would need to respond to any claims that are sort of filed. So with that, I'll turn it back to Kim and move the presentation on forward.
All right, this will be important because the next one is sort of overlapping, so stay tuned. All right, so this is on the ballot thanks to a coalition of Native American tribes, the major donors, tribes obviously that have gaming. In terms of endorsements from political figures, we have our lieutenant governor who's in support of it and our state treasurer. And in opposition, we have the Republican Party. The Democratic Party did not take a position. As far as organizations, we have 27 different tribes and organizations that have come out in support of this. In addition, we have the smaller subsets of the NAACP, some ministers, a bunch of sort of community groups of various sorts that have come out in favor of this. And then in opposition, it's casinos, right? A bunch of casinos that are not Native American casinos, and a union. And then in terms of newspaper endorsements, it's only opposition, from none in support so far, from the San Jose Mercury News, LA Times, Sacramento Bee. And then the spending, the yes spending is these Native American gambling organizations, and the no spending is mostly other gambling organizations, other casinos. So you can see it's sort of gambling organizations against each other in this case. The supporters have raised more money than the opponents, but there's a lot of money in this one. So you're likely to see some ads on this proposition because there's plenty of cash behind it. All right, what questions do you have on this one? Please put them in the Q&A again, and we'll be happy to try to answer those questions for you. If we don't see people, then we'll move on to the next one, and maybe there will be comparative questions because they are very related to each other. I'll give it another second. Looks like no one's asking questions on this one so far. Again, put them in the Q&A if you have a question. Why are the news outlets opposed? You can look those up. I've got a list of the sources at the end of this presentation where you can look at what those outlets said, but we're being nonpartisan, so I'm not going to make arguments pro or con, but I'd be happy to help you figure out where you can access those newspaper endorsements.
So with Proposition 27, this one does focus on sports betting, and specifically it is online sports betting. And it has kind of a number of key components. It's a very long proposition. So first, it would change the California Constitution and state law to allow tribes or gambling companies to offer online sports betting over the internet and mobile devices. People 21 years of age and older in California who are not on tribal lands would be able to place bets no later than September of 2023. It would allow bets on athletic events such as football games, but also on some non-athletic events such as award shows. Certain events would be banned, such as high school games. Tribes that have tribal state compacts, as well as certain gambling companies, typically those that are larger in size, such as those that have online sports betting licenses in at least 10 US states or territories, would be able to apply for a 5-year license to offer online sports betting. The measure does require various sports betting payments to the state. For example, most notably, licensed tribes and gaming companies would pay 10% of sports bets made each month to the state after subtracting various expenses. And those expenses include any bets that are made with credits from promotional offers, prize payments, as well as federal gambling taxes. Any losses which result when expenses are more than the bets may also be used to offset these payments. A certain portion of the monthly payments are required to be made in advance when the sports betting license is approved or renewed. And this would reduce the actual amount paid monthly. So for example, a gambling company must pay $100 million in advance when its 5-year license is approved, and then $10 million afterwards each time the license is renewed. All of the monies would be deposited into this new special fund. The first call on the money would be to support state regulatory costs. After that, the rest would be split for 2 major purposes. 85% would go to address homelessness or gambling addiction program costs, and then 15% would go to tribes that are not involved in online sports betting for tribal government, economic development, and other purposes. Kind of a last few thing, it does create a new regulatory unit within the California Department of Justice to regulate these activities and the games that can be offered. And it also provides new ways to reduce illegal online sports betting. So for example, it requires people who place online sports bets to pay the state a penalty equal to 15% of the amount that they bet. In terms of the fiscal effects, it really, again, depends on how it's interpreted and implemented. For example, how many people place bets, or how the gaming companies take their deductions will determine the amount that's paid to the state, for example. In terms of revenues, we do estimate that there will be increased state revenues, possibly in the hundreds of millions of dollars, but likely not more than $500 million annually. In terms of regulatory costs, we estimate that there would be increased state costs to regulate online sports betting, possibly reaching the mid tens of millions of dollars annually, really depending on how sports betting is regulated, such as the number of licenses that are approved, as well as how much state enforcement is done. And so some or all of these costs would be offset by those increased revenues that come in. So with that, I'll turn things over to Kim again for your next slides.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So we, looking at who got this on the ballot in the first place, it's those online sports betting companies. They obviously stand to profit quite a lot from this. In support, we have the Fresno mayor. We have several mayors, including Sacramento's mayor. In opposition, we have the lieutenant governor, leaders of the assembly and the Senate of both parties. And both political parties, if you can imagine, both major political parties, if you can imagine such a thing, both the Democrats and the Republicans are in opposition to this one. You saw it here. In support in terms of organizations, we have 3 tribes that are coming out in support. Major League Baseball, you can imagine that they might benefit from the betting. These online betting organizations, FanDuel, DraftKings, BetMGM, those are online gaming companies. And then some homeless advocates as well, because some of the money would be directed that way. In opposition, we have 50 Native American tribes. So we had 3 on the other side, 50 on this side. So a lot of difference there. In opposition, we also have organizations like the California Black Chamber of Commerce, Asian Pacific Chamber of Commerce, et cetera, the California League of California Cities, et cetera. So a bunch of organizations. And then we don't have any newspapers writing in support, but we do have some editorial boards in opposition at the LA Times. And it just says Sacramento there. It's a Sacramento Bee, obviously. If you have questions, I'm seeing some raised hands. If you could put your questions in the Q&A, type them in there. We'll be happy to get those to those in a sec. Then on the expenditures, we have, I mean, look at these dollars on the left here. So in favor of it, well, on both sides, in favor of, we have these sports betting companies that are giving, $35 million, $34 million, $25 million. So it's these sports betting companies that of course would benefit here. And then the no is, $78 million from one tribe, 30 million from another. So it's the tribal gaming organizations that are in opposition. tons of money in this one, as you can see. So lots of money on both sides. This is one you'll probably see, especially a lot of ads for, and a lot of mail. So what questions do you have on Prop 27?
So the first question here, would Prop 27 prevent online sports betting on tribal lands?
So if you look at the language for Proposition 27, the proponents intend that 27 can go in effect with 26. They kind of see them kind of complementing one another. And so 27 really focuses on activity outside of tribal lands. I think that there's a little bit of a question under 26 when we say in person on tribal lands, sort of what exactly that entails and whether or not, internet or mobile might be used within kind of the tribal boundaries. And that, I think, is something that is a little bit of a question that sort of remains outstanding.
And then the next question, are the proposed expenditure categories strongly protected by the language in the proposition?
So the language does provide the legislature with flexibility in terms of some of the allocations. So for example, for the 85% that I talked about that goes to homelessness and gambling addiction, the legislature has flexibility in determining how much goes to gambling addiction programs. But in terms of the 85% that are going to those particular pieces, it's supposed to be generally going to those broad purposes. Similarly, on the homelessness side, the legislature does have some flexibility in terms of how exactly the money goes out to localities such as counties and cities, as well as kind of exactly what types of programs they support. But they all have that, they're supposed to have that theme of addressing housing, homelessness needs, et cetera.
Great, thank you. And then I'm looking and it looks like most of the questions were very similar to each other. So if folks have additional questions, go ahead and feel free to pop those into the Q&A, or we can move on.
Somebody asked if both of them fail, or can both of them fail, or does one need to pass? And the answer is yes, they could both fail, they could both pass too. If they did both pass, then there would likely be a court determination about the areas where there's a conflict between the two. How much revenue is expected to go towards homelessness?
So our estimate in terms of the revenues, right, is it could reach the hundreds of millions of dollars, not likely to exceed 500 million. And so it can be lower than 500 million. And so it would be just thinking along those lines, roughly 85% of kind of those monies, because remember, I did say that what first comes off the top is basically recouping the state's cost of regulation. And so that also kind of matters. So it's very difficult to give you a pinpoint exact number, but I think in thinking about that in rough terms, it kind of gives you a sense of how much could be available.
Perfect, thank you so much. Let's move on to Proposition 28. If we could have Michael come on and do a presentation on Prop 28.
Hi, good evening. Michael Alferez with the Legislative Analyst Office. So I'll just start by providing a quick background on arts education and school finance in California, and then I'll get into discussing the measure. So first, just a quick background on arts education. The state law has different requirements for different grade levels to offer instruction in visual and performing arts, but for all grades, the specific courses and amount of instruction provided in these areas is subject to the decision-making of local governing boards. Schools may also provide arts and music instruction through their before and after school and summer programs. Next, just a quick background on school finance. The state is constitutionally required to provide a minimum level of general fund and local property tax revenues each year for public schools and community colleges. In most years, this is equal to about 40% of the state's local general revenue that must be spent to meet this requirement. So with that quick background covered, I'll just get into the measure. So beginning next year, Proposition 28 would require the state to provide additional funding to schools to increase arts education and programming. The amount would be equal to 1% of the funding that K-12 schools received in the prior year, and the funding would be considered a payment above the constitutionally required amount of funding that goes to schools and community colleges currently. So Proposition 28 would distribute the funding through a per student formula and give additional funding for each economically disadvantaged student. Schools must use the funding to increase their arts education programs. The measure has a broad definition of arts, which includes but is not limited to dance, visual arts, music, computer coding, graphic design, script writing, film, and video. Schools with more than 500 students must use 80% of their funding to hire new staff to provide instruction in arts education programs. The California Department of Education may waive this requirement if principals submit a written request showing good cause. The principal of a school site would ultimately determine how to expand their site's arts programs with the funding their schools receives from this measure. Proposition 28 also requires school districts and charter schools to annually report on their website how the funding their school sites received in the prior year were spent, and to certify that the funding was used to increase arts education programs. The measure also allows school districts and charter schools to set aside up to 1% of the funding that their school sites receive for administrative expenses. So for the fiscal effects, we estimate that the Proposition 28 would increase state costs by about $1 billion annually beginning next year for arts education in schools. Over time, the funding for this program would vary based on changes in the required amount of funding for schools and community colleges. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, so let's look at who got this on the ballot. Former LA Unified District Superintendent said that he launched it in order to get this, the arts as a core, just along with art, with math, science, and reading. And he actually put a bunch of money towards it too. So the support, the Democratic Party of California, the former U.S. Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, there's no official opposition on this one. Support, we have, arts organizations, of course, school organizations, unions, and no organized opposition in terms of groups. And then same thing with spending. We have a lot of spending in favor, well, not a lot compared to the gambling ones, but we have spending in favor of it, including Fender Musical Instruments, the company that makes guitars famously, a bunch of individuals and community groups. And then, we have this lopsided spending on this one, right? We don't have money against it. We only have money in favor of this particular measure. So what questions do we have on Prop 28?
Quite a few so far. So first question is, would this amount be added to the constitutionally required amount of funding?
Yes, that is correct. It would be in addition to the funding that schools already receive.
Great. And then the next question is about the inclusion of programming and coding within the arts. And the question related to that is, could a school potentially decide to spend all of its new funding on programming and coding and none on performing arts?
Yes, that is correct. It would be ultimately up to principals to decide how to plan to, expend the funds that they receive through the measure.
Okay. And then would this statute require community input for planning how to spend as part of the local control funding formula in the local control accountability plan? Or is there a separate planning and reporting mechanism?
So the measure states that, that principals would have discretion to decide how to spend the arts programs, but I don't know if I can speak to how that process might look, because it could vary from school district to school or school to school.
Great. And then a few folks wanting to know where the funding for this would come from.
So the funding for this would come from the general fund. So it would take, $1 billion from the general fund and put that towards towards K-12 schools, as opposed to, other programs that are funded with general fund.
Okay, and then someone is asking if it would be possible to show the yes, no slide for Prop 28.
Yes, no slide, like this one?
I believe so.
Do we have other questions?
How many schools would receive funding?
So the measure specifies that all schools would receive some funding from this measure. Just depends on how many kids that they have enrolled and how many of those students are from, economically disadvantaged backgrounds.
Okay, and last question, to what extent would this restore previously cut funding from arts programs?
I'm not sure if I understand the question, but school districts with the funding that they get are able to decide how to spend funding. This would just be additional funding that goes to school districts that to schools that would be specifically for arts education. So, they wouldn't be able to cut their arts education. They would have to increase it with this funding. They wouldn't be able to spend it on other purposes, for example.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, let's move on to Proposition 29. If we could have Sonia present that for us, please.
Thank you so much. Are you able to hear and see me okay?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for having us. I am Sonia Pettick at the Legislative Analyst Office. Now, Proposition 29 concerns kidney dialysis clinics in California. And like my colleagues, I'll first provide a bit of background and then get into the details of the measure. California has about 650 licensed dialysis clinics, each of which is overseen by a medical director who must be a board certified physician. And the role of medical director reflects about one quarter of a full-time position. Together, these 650 clinics serve roughly 80,000 patients per month. Now, a person needs dialysis when they have kidney failure, and a patient's own physician will refer them to the dialysis clinic for treatment, oversee their plan of care, and is required to visit the patient at the clinic during treatment at least once per month. Dialysis is paid for by three main sources: Medicare, Medi-Cal, which is the state's Medicaid program, and group and individual insurance. And there are just a few things I'd like to note about this. So kidney failure is a condition that makes someone eligible for Medicare. And what this means is that Medicare pays for dialysis treatment for the majority of people on dialysis in California. Some patients might also be enrolled in Medi-Cal. In these cases, Medicare is the primary payer, but if someone only is enrolled in Medi-Cal, then Medi-Cal pays the full cost. Some patients have group insurance, usually through an employer, or individual insurance. And these patients also usually transition to Medicare. A group insurer is the main payer for dialysis for a period of 30 months. State and local governments provide group insurance for their employees, eligible retirees, and their families. And I'd note that group and individual insurers typically pay much higher rates for dialysis than Medicare or Medi-Cal. So what would Proposition 29 do? First, it requires a clinic to have a physician, nurse practitioner, or physician assistant on site during all patient treatment hours. And this person must have at least 6 months experience providing care to kidney patients. A clinic can request an exemption to this requirement if they are in an area with a valid shortage of these types of professionals. If the Department of Public Health approves this request, the clinic can fulfill the requirement via telehealth. Proposition 29 also includes a variety of reporting requirements for clinics, including reporting of infection-related information to the Department of Public Health and disclosure of who owns the clinic. Proposition 29 requires clinics to notify and obtain consent from the Department of Public Health before closing a clinic or substantially reducing services. So next, I'll just note the estimated fiscal impact of Proposition 29 on state and local government. We estimate that the requirement to have a clinician on site during all treatment hours would cost each clinic several $100,000 per year. And because of these costs, we assume clinics would do one of a number of things. They may try to negotiate higher payment rates with private commercial insurers, and to a lesser extent with Medi-Cal managed care plans. They may continue operations, but with lower profits. And some may close clinics after seeking and obtaining consent from the Department of Public Health. Those responses by clinics could increase Medi-Cal costs, as well as the cost of state and local government employee and retiree health insurance costs due to higher payment rates, and also due to the fact that some patients may require treatment in costlier settings like hospitals if some clinics were to close. We estimate that these costs would be in the tens of millions of dollars annually. Thank you.
Much. Okay, so it's the if there's anything that random California citizens should weigh in on, obviously it's how we do dialysis, right? This is not the first time this has been on the ballot. It's the Healthcare Workers Union, SEIU, that has put this on the ballot again. And we have in support the Democratic Party and in opposition the Republican Party of California. We have that union, that Healthcare Workers Union, in support of it. In opposition, we have the California Chamber of Commerce, the companies that provide the dialysis, the biggest dialysis companies in the state, the American Nurses Association, Taxpayers Associations, California Medical Association, et cetera. And as far as newspapers, there are none in support so far, and in opposition, we have the LA Times, Sacramento Bee, Mercury News, Orange County Register, etc. And then in terms of expenditures, we have the union that put it on the ballot in favor, and then we have those companies that do the actual dialysis that are on the other side of this. And so you can see that there's a huge difference. The opponents have raised a bunch of money and the supporters have not. So we have, again, I want to say that these numbers are not identical in these two slides because this one isn't as updated as this one. But overall, what this tells us is that we have far more money from those dialysis companies coming into this than we have in the support side. All right, what questions do you have on Prop 29?
So the first question has to do with the why of this proposition. So is there a problem that this proposition is attempting to fix? Are there some clinics that have had a large amount of patient damage or other kinds of issues?
Thank you for the question. That's not something that I can specifically weigh in on. Our analysis doesn't cover the scope of sort of why the proponents, what problem they may have identified to put the measure on the ballot.
Same here, but I will give you some resources at the end where you can find that information pretty easily. So hang on to the end of the presentation, we'll get to that. Next question.
And then is this proposition substantially different from the similar ballot measure from the previous election cycle?
Oh, yes, that interesting question, of course. This measure is very similar to the 2020 measure. However, there are a couple key differences. One, the previous measure would have required a physician to be on site during all treatment hours. Proposition 29, by contrast, this year would require a physician, nurse practitioner, or physician assistant to be on site during all treatment hours. And then for the clinics that are in areas with valid shortages of these types of professionals, Proposition 29 would allow the clinic to seek an exemption from the Department of Public Health to fulfill the requirement with via telehealth. And the previous measure in 2020, the exemption would have allowed the clinic to fulfill the requirement with a nurse practitioner or physician assistant. And then the other key difference that I would raise is this Proposition 29 included one additional reporting requirement, namely that it would have to disclose to patients and potential patients a list of all the physicians who have an ownership stake in the clinic of at least 5%, and also to provide a list to the Department of Public Health of all the owners of a clinic who own at least 5% of the clinic.
Great. And then the next question asks, would the annual cost increase be covered by private insurers, or would the money come from somewhere else?
Well, the added cost to state and local governments would come in two ways. One would be if clinics were able to negotiate with Medi-Cal managed care plans to at least some extent, there could be additional Medi-Cal costs. And then there would also be costs if the plans were able to negotiate higher, if the clinics were able to negotiate higher rates with the private insurers who provide coverage for state and local government employees and retirees.
And then next question.
Sorry, we're getting shorter on time than I would like us to be. So let's move on to the next one. Thank you for your answers and questions. All right, Proposition 30.
Yes, good evening. Rachel Ehlers with the Legislative Analyst Office, talking about Proposition 30. So Proposition 30, basically in a nutshell, would implement a new tax on high income earners to raise funding to use for programs related to zero emission vehicles and wildfire related activities. So specifically, beginning in January 2023, Proposition 30 would require taxpayers with incomes over $2 million to annually pay an additional tax of 1.75% on the share of their income that's over that $2 million threshold. The tax would end in January 2043 unless the state is able to drop its greenhouse gas emissions below certain levels before 2043. So the additional funding from this new tax revenue would be used for two broad categories. First, for activities related to zero emission vehicles. So those are vehicles that don't emit pollution from their tailpipes, like electric vehicles or hydrogen powered vehicles. The funding would be used for activities like providing payments to households, businesses, and governments to help them purchase new zero emission vehicles. Also some share for helping buy heavy duty zero emission vehicles like trucks, and for some programs to encourage less driving and improve local air quality. There'd also be some funding for charging infrastructure for these zero emission vehicles. So funding used to install or operate charging or fueling stations for the vehicles, both at apartment buildings, but also single family homes and at public locations as well. So of this funding for zero emission vehicles, at least half of the money is required by the proposition to be spent on projects that benefit people who live near or in heavily polluted or low income communities. So that's 80% of the new tax revenue. The other 20% the proposition would dedicate to wildfire suppression and prevention activities. So the state would have to prioritize that funding for spending on hiring, training, and retaining state firefighters, but some of the funding could be used for other wildfire response and prevention activities. So in terms of fiscal effects, we estimate that this new tax on high income taxpayers would generate between $3.5 billion and $5 billion each year, growing over time. Based on the spending requirements in Proposition 30, this would translate to between $2.8 billion and $4 billion each year for those zero emission vehicle programs. Just as a point of context, the state typically right now spends kind of in the hundreds of millions of dollars range for these programs, although the state did recently commit to spending $10 billion over 5 years for these types of zero emission vehicle activities. For the wildfire, we estimate that the new tax would generate between $700 million and $1 billion annually for those activities. Again, for a point of context, the state typically spends around $2 billion to $4 billion now, primarily for firefighting in those activities. Some other fiscal effects worth noting, we think there could be potential decrease in state and local costs for wildfire response and recovery. This would really depend on the degree to which the additional funding on wildfire activities ends up reducing the severity of future wildfires. And that's something that the degree to which that will happen is really unknown, and therefore the degree of potential savings also is unknown. There also could be a decrease in state revenues for other types of activities because some taxpayers probably would take some steps to reduce the amount of income taxes that they owe. And this could reduce existing general fund revenues from the other portions of their income tax that they pay. But again, the degree to which this might happen is unknown. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Dr. Nelder.
Thank you so much. All right, so Lyft, the ride sharing company, is the major force behind this being on the ballot. In support, we have the Democratic Party in California, and the Republicans are opposed, as you would expect the world to be. But we have Democrats who are elected in support of it, but the governor is in opposition to this particular one. So that's kind of interesting. In support, we have, of course, Lyft again, and some trade associations, the American Lung Association, Tom Steyer, who's been involved in politics in the state. And then in opposition, we have the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, the California Teachers Association. Those two aren't together on very many things, but here we are. The California Chamber of Commerce and the California Small Business Association. In terms of newspapers, we have a little bit of a split here, where the San Francisco Chronicle and Bay Area Reporter are in favor, and the Mercury News, LA Times, and Orange County Register are in opposition. In terms of spending, we have, a good chunk, 25 million plus from Lyft. Then we have an electrical workers union and some other smaller organizations and individuals that are in favor of it. In opposition, we have individuals spending, $1 million, several of them, and close to it. And only one group, Sierra Pacific Industries. So the spending there is lopsided again. Lots of money in favor of it, very little money in opposition. Again, let me say these numbers don't add up to this. That's just because they were reported at different times. So this is meant to illustrate that there's such a difference between the pro and con sides in terms of spending. All right, what questions do you have on Prop 30?
So first question, would the funding for this proposition essentially be an additional tax on the rich?
Yes, this would levy a new tax on income earners on the share of their income over $2 million. 1.75%.
And then the next question, would that be gross income or?
Taxable income, the same way other income taxes are levied.
Those are the only two questions we have on this one.
Well, thank you so much for that. And we will move on to our last measure, Proposition 31.
Hi, thank you. Sonia Pettick again. Proposition 31 would ban in-person stores and vending machines from selling most flavored tobacco products and tobacco product flavor enhancers. It is a referendum on Senate Bill 793, which was a law passed in 2020. SB 793 did not take effect in 2021 as planned because this referendum qualified for the ballot. So now voters will be weighing in on whether to put SB 793 into effect. So importantly, because referenda can be a little confusing, I thought I'd make a note about what a yes and no vote mean. And thank you for that slide as well. So voting yes on Proposition 31 means that SB 793 goes into effect. In other words, the ban on the sale of certain flavored tobacco products would go into effect. Voting no means 793 does not go into effect. The flavor ban in Proposition 31 does not apply to shisha tobacco, certain cigars, and loose leaf tobacco. And Proposition 31 would charge a penalty of $250 for each violation of the requirements. Before I pass it over to my colleague Seth Kirstein, who is going to discuss the estimated fiscal impact of Proposition 31, I want to mention a few things about current flavored tobacco rules, because there are many rules at the federal, state, and local levels, and they can change on a sort of regular basis. So since 2009, federal law has banned cigarettes from having flavors, with the exception of menthol. However, the Federal Food and Drug Administration recently proposed a rule to also ban menthol cigarettes, as well as all flavored cigars. The FDA is still deciding, however, to whether or not to finalize this rule. The FDA is also responsible for authorizing new tobacco products. And as of June, it had authorized fewer than 50 new tobacco products, including 23 electronic products, which are all tobacco flavored or unflavored. The FDA has denied authorization to more than 1 million flavored electronic tobacco products. In 2020, the FDA also began stepping up enforcement against certain unauthorized electronic products, particularly those that are marketed toward youth. The state and local governments can also have additional rules about tobacco. So for example, many local governments have bans against certain sales of flavored tobacco products, and about a third of Californians live in such areas. California charges tobacco taxes on cigarettes, including electronic tobacco products. And last year, these taxes raised about $2 billion, and a majority of this funding supports healthcare programs. I'm now going to turn it over to Seth to go over the estimated fiscal impact of Proposition 31.
Thanks, Sonia. Seth Kirstein with the Legislative Analyst's Office. Prop 31's main fiscal effect is a likely reduction in state tobacco tax revenues. In particular, we estimate that this revenue loss likely would be in the range of tens of millions to around $100 million per year. Where we end up in that range depends on a variety of factors, most notably how consumers respond to the measure. Prop 31 also would affect state and local government healthcare costs. The measure likely would reduce tobacco consumption, which in turn would improve health. And at least in the short term, that could result in lower government healthcare costs. Over time, better health could lead to people living longer, which could lead to higher healthcare costs. So the sign of the measure's longer run effect on government healthcare costs is unclear. That's all we've got. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. If you have your hand raised, if you go ahead and put your question in the Q&A, that's how we can answer them. So the tobacco companies put this on the ballot. They wanted to overturn the existing law. So it's a referendum on a law that was already passed, and they want it to go away. The Democratic Party is in support and the Republican Party is in opposition. The governor is specifically in support as well. Supporting banning the tobacco is the American Lung Association, the American Heart Association, SEIU Union, the California State PTA. In opposition, we have American Snuff Company, Philip Morris, RJ Reynolds. It's a bunch of tobacco companies essentially. And then in support, as far as newspapers go, we have a bunch of newspapers: San Jose Mercury News, San Francisco Chronicle, LA Times, etc. And then in opposition, we have a couple: the Orange County Register and the Daily Breeze. And then when we look at the spending, Michael Bloomberg has weighed in on this and put some money into the yes side, as has, well, some money, $5 million almost, well, $4+ million. Kaiser Permanente, the healthcare organization, has put over $1 million. California Teachers Association, Cancer, Lung, Heart Associations, etc. Healthy California too. And then the no side, it's tobacco companies essentially. So the supports, this money is so out of date that I actually just want to change it, which I will later, but you can see that there is actually more money in support for this particular measure. What questions do you have on 31?
Not seeing any questions in the Q&A so far.
Okay, we'll give you a minute if anybody wants to pop a question in there on Prop 31. We've got some folks who can answer them.
Okay, so we do have one question, which is asking whether this proposition primarily impacts menthol tobacco.
This proposition definitely would impact menthol cigarettes, but it would also have an effect on electronic tobacco products that are flavored, or tobacco product flavor enhancers, which is flavor that you can add to to an electronic tobacco product to add a flavor to the device. And so what we mean by electronic tobacco products are e-cigarettes, vapes, pods, mods, etc.
That appears to be the only one.
Okay, well, thank you so much. All right, so I promised that I would give you some resources that you can go to look at the arguments or further information that people might want to get for that. Cal Matters has an excellent voter guide that does go over the main arguments and has some links to the newspaper endorsements that some people were asking about. Voters Edge and Ballotopedia have similar sorts of content. The IGS Berkeley Library has, they compile things like the polling data and the articles that are written about each of the measures. They'll actually usually have a link to this as well on there. And of course, the LAO, if you want to look at more detail at what these folks have put together on these issues, and the official voter guide. And Voters Edge, if I didn't mention that one, that's very good too. So I would check out any or all of those if you're interested in digging a little bit deeper, if you're still not sure on some of these measures. I'd like to really thank the College of Social Sciences and Interdisciplinary Studies at Sacramento State that supported this work. The Political Science Department, obviously the LAO. It's been so fantastic to have them help us sort these things through. They're folks who actually know what they're talking about and can give us some pointers. And then the Sacramento Public Library for putting this on for so many years. Speaking of the Sacramento Public Library, they will be having events through October at various library branches around the region, where they will show these videos in person so that people can come together and discuss the initiatives. Once you have your actual ballot, you can go through it. So look for those at saclibrary.org. And then these will be made into videos per initiative. And those will be available on the PI website. I know that's a long URL. Again, if you just Google Project for an Informed Electorate, which is maybe also kind of long, but if you Google that, you can find those videos available. And I'll also send an email to anybody who was registered for this when those are available. They will also have a version with Spanish subtitles. So if you have anyone you want to share these with, if you want to have a watch party or suggest a watch party, we certainly encourage that. These are useful for any California voter. And so we'd appreciate anybody's help in getting these to as many voters as possible this time around. We're doing this a little bit earlier than we've done in the past, so hopefully there's time for folks to get those videos shared with as many people as possible. So again, thank you so much for being here. Have an excellent night, and we hope that you are better informed and ready to vote. Thanks to everyone who participated and helped with this, and we'll see you in 2 years. Have a good night.